So today we're going to go over Kowalik's article on the ethics of vaccine refusals. So he first starts by talking about the argument for vaccine mandates. So vaccine mandates rely on the premise that, everyone who can get vaccinated has a moral obligation to get vaccinated. So we're doing this because, for other people who can't get vaccinated, the immunocompromised, and we're also just doing it for general public health. So it would be unethical for someone to refuse to get vaccinated. He calls this an obligation to get vaccinated, or OTV. So he cites Brennan as a person who, formulates the OTV argument. I looked up the Brennan article, and it looks like he's trying to argue from this libertarian point of view. So he's already starting from a minimal government point of view and saying, look, can we still justify these vaccine mandates? All right, so let's look at the obligation to vaccinate argument. Premise one, there are certain vaccines that have low incidence of side effect and are effective at preventing serious illness. Premise two, it would be a disaster if a large majority of individuals failed to receive various vaccines. Premise three, individual freedoms can be overridden to prevent a disaster. So the conclusion, it's permissible to force individuals to receive certain vaccines against dangerous illnesses. So Kowalik's going to claim that there are assumptions going on here in the background. So one, that not getting vaccinated is going to be sufficient to cause a disaster. It's imminent if people don't get vaccinated. Two, the mandate is sufficient to prevent the disaster. So is actually mandating this enough to actually prevent the disaster that you're trying to prevent? And finally, he's going to say that overriding individual freedoms might cause another disaster. It's like we have unintended consequences. So, could possibly mandating this vaccine cause another disaster that might even be worse than the disaster we were trying to avoid in the first place. So these are background assumptions going on in the OTV arguments, the obligation to get vaccinated arguments. Kowalik's going to claim that we can't just assume that these arguments are true. On top of that, he's going to say, look, this disaster could possibly be twisted, and maybe we could say public smoking or public health is a disaster, or smoking in public is such a disaster that it might justify other paternalistic laws and more restrictions on individual freedoms. So he's going to argue that C, or OTV number 3, is going to be false. So he's going to argue that individual freedoms can be overridden to prevent disasters. He's going to claim that that premise of the OTV arguments is going to be false. Restrictions on freedom can only be justified if they are, reasonable to preserve what makes human life worth living. That's what he's going to claim. So there are only certain restrictions that we can have on freedom, and it's going to, quote, preserve, what makes life worth living. This is kind of a vague notion that he's going to use throughout the argument, what makes life worth living. It's something that he could have defined a little bit clearer probably if he had more space. Okay, so freedom is a necessary condition of a life worth living. So he's giving us a little bit more of these, what makes a life worth leading, and he's just going to say freedom. We all agree that freedom is makes a life worth leading. Without freedom, he's going to say a life isn't worth leading. But this reasonably necessary to preserve what makes life worth leading is also something that could be as elastic as disaster. And so really this isn't giving us much in terms of our moral obligation. So some are going to appeal to the principle that, we have an obligation to prevent unjust harm to others, or we have an obligation to prevent risk of harm to others. The principle of beneficence, or at least the principle of non-malfeasance. But Kowalik's going to respond and say, look, vaccines themselves aren't risk-free. So if I go and get a vaccine, I'm taking on a certain risk to prevent risk to others. But others should also have an obligation to accept increased risk to themselves to prevent increased risk to him. So he's saying, look, you can use that principle in both directions. You can say, I have an obligation to prevent risk to others, but others also have an obligation to take on certain risks to prevent risks to me. So he's saying, look, we can't really use that principle here. Others might appeal to the principle of do no harm. But Kowalik's going to argue that the mandates are also causing harm. They are causing harm by violating individuals' autonomy, and this is going to be a different kind of harm. So the reasonably necessary standards for preventing a disaster are going to have to be in proportion to this kind of harm, the harm of violating individuals' autonomy. So what he's trying to say is to justify vaccine mandates, the harm to others needs to exceed the harm of violating individuals' autonomy. I don't know. I'm not quite sure how he's going to do that measurement, but he's going to have to argue that the harm to individuals dying and all of that is going to have to exceed violating someone's autonomy. On top of that, he's going to say prospective public health is not going to be enough to infringe on bodily autonomy. So you might think that healthcare workers have a special obligation because of the nature of their field, but Kowalik's going to argue that vaccinations are not an occupational risk necessary to performing healthcare duties, which means you can do the job without being vaccinated. He talks about, he cites this paper twice actually, and it's talking about how 51% of doctors wouldn't get the flu vaccine if it wasn't mandated, but because it is mandated, they all end up getting it. Kowalik's citing someone who's saying, look, most people wouldn't get it if it wasn't mandated. Now, it's a really interesting quote, but that I looked up that quote, and it seems to be an opinion. That doesn't really seem to be a fact backed up by actual surveys or any kind of information. Kowalik also goes on to claim that the vaccine safety is unproven, and sometimes the efficacy has contrary evidence. Again, same study. That person was looking at flu vaccines. So maybe that's the case with flu vaccines, and maybe that's okay with that we shouldn't be mandating that because the science isn't fully there yet. But when the science is there, specifically with the COVID vaccines, and it's supporting this and saying, look at the efficacy here. It is incredibly effective, and it is proven that it is helpful and at preventing diseases. So, maybe that would have been the case for flu vaccines, but it's definitely not the case with COVID vaccines. One last thing, he's going to say, look, the industry, the people who make these vaccines, they have a vested interest in, returning profits, and they're not actually interested in the public health. But I don't know. I mean, that seems like a really naive argument about business. If someone, is a repeat customer at a business, they are, going to learn from their first experience. Like, oh, if I found out that this company only cares about profits and they don't actually care about public health, then no one's going to go to that company in the future. Now, if companies only had one experience with customers, then yes, you're right. They absolutely would have, incentives to trick the customer. But because they know they're going to be getting repeat customers and repeat, service, that they have, it's in their own best interest to, care about the public health and care about the health of the patient. So yeah, I don't know. That argument just doesn't really work. Okay, herd immunity. So herd immunity is going to be disputed by some, but Kowalik's going to grant for argument's sake that herd immunity is going to be an unequivocal public good. But he's going to claim, look, the risks and burdens aren't going to be distributed evenly. He's going to claim the vaccinated are the ones who are taking on all the risk, and the unvaccinated are the ones who are getting all the benefit. So he's going to say, look, this is going to cause a free rider problem. So free riders usually come from economics. They're usually about social welfare. A free rider is someone who doesn't pay into this, social welfare, but receives from the social welfare. So they're getting a free ride. And he's going to say, look, these free rider instances are okay if everyone consents, but a mandate would make certain free riders unethical. And so Kowalik's going to say, look, no one has a responsibility to take on risk for others' benefits, even if the individual who takes on that risk is also going to receive the same benefits. And so then he's going to claim that, look, these mandates are going to be discriminatory. There are going to be certain people who have, genetic response to these vaccines are going to have such adverse effects. And so forcing these people to get vaccines is going to be treating people unfairly. And so, in another instance of where like these mandates are going to be unethical. Okay, so the free rider is usually the person who, doesn't get vaccinated, but can get vaccinated. So the anti-vaxxer in another sense, as opposed to the person who, has a medical reason for not getting vaccinated. That person normally isn't considered a free rider, but according to Kowalik, he's turning it around. So the U.S. Supreme Court settled in Jacobson versus Massachusetts that citizens are not allowed to be free riders when it comes to vaccine mandates. But Kowalik is going to say, look, they're not the free riders. The people who are choosing not to get vaccinated are not free riders. They didn't choose to be on this ride in the first place. Others around them set up the ride. The vaccinated are the ones who set up the ride and then forced them to pay for it. They didn't want to be on this ride in a certain sense. So he's saying, look, the people who are choosing not to get vaccinated, the people who are choosing their autonomy and respecting that and, choosing not to get vaccinated, they're not free riders. And he's saying, look, he's not sure why the people who are medically exempt aren't also considered free riders. Why are the people who are medically exempt the ones who are getting preferential treatment here? He doesn't think that medical exemptions are any different than non-medical exemptions, and they should be treated equally. And so because of this, there's going to be no moral obligation in the OTV argument. And so the medically exempt are, not allowed to take the free ride is what he's going to say. So to quote Kowalik, he says, "I must see myself as having unconditional value, as being an end in myself in the conditions of my value of my chosen ends, in virtue of my capacity to bestow my ends by rationally choosing them." So things have meaning and things have value because we choose them, but people themselves are inherently valuable. We need to see them as being inherently valuable. This is an idea that comes from deontology and Kant, that we each have our own rational self-direction, and because of that, and because we value it, we should value it in other people as well. So this means for Kowalik that the necessary, reasonably necessary standard is going to have to meet this standard. So restrictions on personal freedom are going to need to be reasonably necessary to preserve what makes life worth living. This seems to be kind of contradictory. So what he's saying, because freedom and sorry about the plane, but freedom and autonomy themselves are what he's trying to restrict here. So restrictions on our freedom are permissible if they are reasonably necessary to preserve our freedom. So I don't really know what he's trying to get at here. It seems to be going in a circle. Okay, so he's now asking the question, does herd immunity, or does an individual's contribution to herd immunity offset the coercively, the violating someone's rights, so the vaccine mandates? So he gives us this argument that public health is not going to trump individuals' autonomy. He starts with the premise that autonomy is constitutive of our existence as rational beings. That's what he was quoting about before. Premise 2 is going to be that autonomy is a necessary condition for a life worth living. Conclusion 1, so autonomy is as valuable as life itself. This is going to come from premises 1 and 2. Now we have a second conclusion, since, from our first conclusion that autonomy is as valuable as life itself. Any partial destruction of autonomy is as bad as a partial destruction of life itself. Then he's going to make this pretty plausible premise that immediate harm has normative priority over potential harm. This makes sense, if someone is going to cause, we see the exact harm and we're weighing that against something that might happen, we clearly have an obligation to prevent the harm we're literally seeing right now. We're not totally sure the other harm will happen, but we clearly have an obligation to prevent this harm here. So from this third premise, he derives his final conclusion, the third conclusion here. So autonomy trumps an obligation to eliminate or minimize any associated risks of life. Kowalik's going to go even further and say, it's not wrong even if we're exposing them to the risk of dying. He's going to, say, provided that the risk is intrinsic to human agency and what makes a life worth living. Again, I'm not quite sure what he means here by this, the risk that would make life worth living. Honestly, it made me think of base jumping. So, that thrill, it makes life worth living. But that's only going to cause harm to the individual. So I'm not quite sure what risks he's thinking about here. Okay, but risks are unknown. They're in our life all the time. We can't avoid risk at all. Almost everything we do could possibly risk others. So he's going to say because, there's risk everywhere, that we have it's morally permissible, I think is what he's going to say, or we must have the ability to expose others to risk of harm. We must have the ability to expose others to the risk of harm. This seems insane. I mean, I guess it's unintended versus intended. Like, if you know that you're exposing someone to the risk of harm, like, you do not have a right to do that. But if you're unintentionally exposing someone to a risk of harm, yeah, okay, maybe you do, but I wouldn't say it's a right that you have. Okay, so, because we are, possibly exposing people to the risk of death all the time, mandating something just because of the risk of death isn't going to be enough to justify any mandate outlawing it. It would cause a slippery slope. If we could say, we're justifying this because it's causing the risk of death, then it seems like, and if any action is possibly causing a risk of death to others, then we should be able to outlaw any, action at all, or we should be able to prohibit certain actions. But this is an absurd consequence. How could we limit every single human action? So, it's like unintended consequences is really what he's thinking about here. If I buy a cup of coffee, how many people in Guatemala had to die for me to get that cup of coffee? And so, because we use the justification for preventing death to someone to justify vaccine mandates, then maybe we should use that same reasoning to outlaw cups of coffee, which, that doesn't really seem to work, or most people wouldn't agree with that. That seems like an absurd consequence. So he's going to say risk limitivism, specifically about dying, entails eliminating all human actions. Okay, so now he's going to give us this other argument. This is an argument from discrimination. The first premise is that all human actions and social norms presuppose a commitment to the value of human agency. The second premise is that bodily autonomy is one of the constitutive conditions of human agency. This is something he's been going on about for a while. The third premise is going to say, if the second premise is true, then we have exclusive ownership of our innate biological characteristics. These are constitutive of the kind of being that we inherently are. The fourth premise is going to be that discrimination based on inherent biological characteristics negates the value of human agency. So he's going to conclude that discrimination based on innate biological characteristics is unethical. So most people agree that we shouldn't be discriminating based on, inherent biological characteristics. Like we shouldn't be discriminating at someone because of their skin color or because they're gay or something like that. So he's going to make this argument that, by analogy, that we shouldn't be mandating vaccines. So to make this analogy, he's going to say, okay, let's do this crazy thought experiment. Let's suppose that there's a treatment to prevent homosexuality. So just right there, I don't even know what he means, but let's just go along with it for argument's sake, that there is some treatment and it prevents homosexuality. I don't really know what that means, but whatever. And then there's a disease that is only affecting elderly homosexuals. So, but the vaccine is only going to be effective in children before they start, showing signs of being gay or not. So it's like, should we give this vaccine to everyone, because they might possibly develop this disease later on? And he's going to say, no, definitely not. This might even amount to a crime against humanity. And he's going to say, look, even parental consent isn't going to be enough to justify this. And it's again because you're discriminating against their inherent biological characteristics, like you're discriminating against them being gay. Or I guess that's how the argument's supposed to work. So then let's take this analogy, and he gives us another argument that's going to extend to vaccine mandate discrimination. The first premise is that mandatory vaccinations involve a range of discriminatory measures intended to augment the natural state of our immune systems. The second premise is that the natural state of our immune systems is an innate and healthy biological characteristic of every human being. The third premise is that mandatory vaccinations discriminate against innate and healthy biological characteristics. The conclusion of this is that mandatory vaccinations of humans are unethical. So to me, this argument is suspect. VM2 it's not clear what it means, and it's not clear that the natural state of our immune systems is a characteristic of our human body. I mean, I guess it's a part of our human body, but it's definitely not the same thing in characteristic as being gay or as being black or anything like that. And then the VM3 here, the mandatory vaccinations discriminate against innate biological characteristics. Well, so discrimination is going to have to say a certain group is being treated differently. But what group here is actually being discriminated against? If all people are being treated equally, then, I'm not quite sure where the discrimination is happening, especially if he's talking about healthy people. So maybe we're discriminating against unhealthy people, people who can't get the vaccine because their immune system isn't working. But then he's not talking about them. He's talking about, so in that population of healthy people, who is he discriminating against if all of the healthy people are the ones who have to get the vaccine? So yeah, I'm just not sure this argument completely goes through. So Kowalik is just arguing against vaccine mandates. He's not arguing against paternalistic laws in general. So he's going to have to draw a distinction between why certain paternalistic laws are going to be justifiable, but vaccine mandates aren't. So he's thinking about, seatbelt laws as paternalistic laws, or age restrictions on certain goods. Why can't people under 21 buy, alcohol or cigarettes? And he's going to say that, look, the difference here is that vaccines are irrevocably altering your individual constitution. Now, I guess he means, your DNA or something inside of you. Or maybe he's saying, like, look, it's affecting your autonomy. That's a part of your individual constitution, too, according to him. So vaccines are, not just a behavioral choice or a behavioral preference, but vaccines are a reversible medical procedure. This is something that can't be undone. And so because of that, then maybe we shouldn't be allowed to mandate it. It should only be a voluntary procedure. So we also allow for individuals to be, institutionalized. Involuntary psychological treatment. So vaccine mandates are going to, permanently alter a healthy immune system, whereas involuntary psychological treatment is only going to be treating people with already diminished agency, and the intervention is meant to give them more agency. So Kowalik's going to argue that any involuntary treatment would be unethical. So any compulsion or discrimination is going to be unethical if it's used to facilitate, incentivize, or normalize unwanted changes to our human constitution. So it's not even just that he's arguing against it. He's saying because of the unwanted changes to our constitution, and I assume genetics, I'm not quite sure what he means by human constitution, but unwanted changes to our personhood in some way that can't be gone back on. Because they can't be gone back on, because they're irreversible, these are things that shouldn't be mandated. It's unethical to be mandating these things. Okay, so he's going to say, look, maybe we do have justification for vaccine mandates, but we're going to need to go out and find those stronger justifications. We need stronger reasons for it. Kowalik's argument is just proposing an argument against vaccine mandates. He's really saying that it amounts to discrimination based on innate biological characteristics. And again, so this argument is going to be, an argument by analogy. So the analogy with the anti-gay vaccine that prevented the disease. Since we can't discriminate against that one, we also analogously can't discriminate for vaccines in this case. So to argue against an argument by analogy like he's doing here, you're going to have to show how it's disanalogous. Why is the anti-gay vaccine different than the COVID-19 vaccines he's arguing about here? So he's even going to say, look, it's not going to be defeated. This autonomy is not going to be defeated by any emergencies or a pandemic. And it's also even going to extend to people in the healthcare industry. So doctors, nurses, all of this, he's going to say, look, you can't even mandate vaccines in those circumstances. Okay, so finally, the only kind of sensible thing I saw in this paper was that he was saying that arguments do not imply that, or his argument here, his paper is not implying that people should not get vaccinated, okay? So go get vaccinated. He's not saying that, but he's not saying don't go get vaccinated. What he's saying is that these mandates themselves aren't ethical. He's not concerned about actually whether anyone does or doesn't go get vaccinated. What he's concerned about is the mandates, and he's trying to protect individual freedoms. Okay, so that's the end of my notes. I'm not sure I completely agree with Kowalik's arguments. Actually, almost all of them I think are just bad arguments. As I was reading it, I was coming up with these ideas of how to argue against it. So that's what I want you guys to think about. I want you to look through his arguments, look through the paper, and try and think about, okay, what's going on here? What's wrong? This reasoning doesn't really seem to work out. I don't agree with this. So when that happens, stop and think, okay, why is that happening? What is stopping me from reaching that conclusion? All right, I'll see you guys in class. An adverse effect from a vaccine, they are going to be discriminated against in this certain sense by mandates, according to Kowalik. Kowalik's gonna say though that Kowalik, yeah. So Kowalik is Kowalik. So Kowalik is just arguing Kowalik. This is just so backwards though, because I get what he's saying. We're creating the right and we're forcing the people to go get vaccinated, but the people who can't get vaccinated for medical reasons, we're doing all of this for them. We're trying to protect them. They're not free riders. They can't be free riders. They would love to take the ride. They would love to be protected, but they can't protect themselves because of their immune system. So they're relying on all of us. Whereas the other people who are not getting for non-medical reasons, I don't really understand why. Maybe it's their religious exemptions. Maybe, but I can't think of the philosophic reasons, or being afraid of needles, or being afraid of the medicine. These aren't really good reasons, and they're definitely not on par with people who have a suppressed immune system. Immunosuppressed system.